Yeah.
And then you show the poster.
Yeah, I might as well show the poster. That's great. All right. Awesome. All right. Thank you all for coming on December 19th, right for the holiday. Welcome. I guess this will be the last one of the year for the China Humanities and Global Studies Research Hub at HKU, based here in the Faculty of Arts. And today we are very fortunate to have two colleagues come down, thank you, from Shenzhen University. Professor Péter Hajdu and Professor Zhou Mingying from the College of International Studies, just up to our north right here. And the title of the panel, as you can see from the poster, is Ordinary Culture and Extraordinary Times, Climate Change and the Demand for a New Morality. And you can read the blurbs, as you probably have already. But we will have each speaker speak for about 30 minutes or so. We have plenty of time. We have the room reserved. And then after that, we can open up to questions and comments and discussions about the topics that are presented on here. I'll just do very brief biographies of my colleagues and friends from up the north. Professor Hajdu is the author of numerous articles and books. He's a distinguished professor of comparative literature. He has a forthcoming book this coming year, Hungarian Literature as World Literature. And his most recent monograph is Modern Hungarian Culture and the Classics. So, you know, since I am based in a comparative literature department, and happily so, I'm very happy to have two comp-lit panels basically coming down here, and also comparative literature as, in some ways, I won't say its origin, but when I think of comparative literature, one of the first things we should think about is what's now Eastern Europe, Central Europe, right? And the kind of impact and importance of those early critics, professors, scholars, and writers. Professor Hajdu is also the editor-in-chief of a very long-standing and important journal of comparative literature and culture called Neo-Helicon. And I urge you all to check that one out in your research. Our other distinguished speaker is Professor Zhou Mingying, who has been at Shenzhen U since 2022. She has a PhD from here in Hong Kong. Yeah. She's one of us, so to speak, from Lingnan. And her main research interests include Raymond Williams, cultural studies, and science fiction, literature, and culture. She's published numerous articles in a number of indexed journals, competitive journals. And she's also, I think, just completed a grant for a project of philosophy and social sciences of China, which was the critical appraisal of Raymond Williams's fiction, which you also talk about here today. Yeah. So I also really am happy to have someone, a scholar of Raymond Williams, and who uses him as well, because he's such a kind of, I think, important figure for cultural studies, but just for kind of intellectual history, I think, really kind of very important thinker. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleagues. Yeah. So Péter, you'll go first, or Mingying? Okay, great. Yeah. Your PowerPoint. We do not. Yeah, we are going to record them. Yeah, so we'll have the online audience later. Then we'll put it on. We're working on a channel through HKU, but then we'll also have them on YouTube.
Okay. Thanks to Dan for introducing me, and also thanks to Péter for letting me to be the first to give my talk. The title of my talk today is Culture is Ordinary, Reconsidering Raymond Williams' Legacy and Contemporary Culture Studies. And I'm going to deal with these 7 topics, 7 questions. First one is how Welsh is Raymond Williams? I think many people know about Raymond Williams, but not many know that Raymond Williams is a Welshman. So for the first question, I'm going to talk about how Welsh is Raymond Williams and how important is that identity. And the second question is what impact does the Williams experience of teaching at adult education school have on the formation of culture theory? And the third question is how to understand Raymond Williams' important concept, structural feeling. And the fourth question is another important of his concept is cultural materialism, and how do we understand that concept, and what's the connection between these two? And the fifth question is how are the concept of cultural materialism and the notion of structural feeling applied or embodied in his fiction? And the sixth question is Williams' culture theory still valid to analyze cultural phenomena and issues contained in contemporary cultural economic era? And the last question is comes to the title, how to understand culture is ordinary. Okay, so first question, how Welsh is Raymond Williams? Founders of intellectual or national movement often turn out not to be quite what their followers imagine. Freud's reading of Moses is a famous example. The founder of Judaism, Freud suggests, was in fact an Egyptian. And there's a similar irony in the fact that the founder of what is called British cultural criticism, which in practice has largely meant English cultural criticism, is Raymond Williams, a Welshman. And what perhaps enabled Williams in the 1950s to begin thinking about English culture in almost anthropological terms, tracing its development, its values, its internal contradictions, was the fact that he was looking at it, at least in part, from the outside. His Welsh identity gave him the critical distance. So the founder of English cultural study was in fact not English. And many commentators in Britain, including Fred Inglis, have dismissed the idea that there is anything distinctive about the Welsh perspective, but the history suggests otherwise. A self-consciously Welsh viewpoint often brings with it a very different approach to politics, both domestic and international. Williams' work is shaped by that difference, and even when it's not explicitly foregrounded, his contribution to cultural studies then is not just theoretical, it's also positional. He brought to the study of culture a deep awareness of class, religion, and language, and he did so not from the center, but from the margins. That's part of what makes his work so enduring and so radical. Williams' fiction was for a long time largely ignored or dismissed, and that has less to do with the equality of the work itself. It had more to do with the ideological values underpinning cultural hierarchies. There was a long-standing assumption that Wales didn't have a serious artistic culture because the criteria for evaluating art were shaped by metropolitan centers like London and Paris. It requires frames that allow for the identification and evaluation of Welsh traditions in their own terms. And Border Country, Williams' first and most successful novel in the context of Welsh writing English, was in the broad history of the Welsh novel, which includes a strong Welsh language tradition, and is profoundly Welsh novel. It's a theme of return, assimilation, generational conflict, betrayal, and the internal diversity of seemingly homogeneous rural communities are all central to Welsh literature. Today, the post-colonial frame is often used to articulate these kinds of comparisons. It's a problematic frame in relation to Wales, but it can be illuminating when you look at inventories of colonial fiction. Features like masked hybridity, formal dislocation, the blending of realistic and folk traditions, ambiguity around gender and national identity, and the struggle to represent one language through another. You find all of these in Welsh literature. So if it walks like a duck, quakes like a duck, and has feathers, might Wales be a colony after all? Historians have long insisted that Wales was never a colony. After all, it was part of the British Empire's core, not one of its colonized outposts. The South Wales coalfield, for instance, generated immense wealth and fueled British imperial power. But historians are often limited by the empirical nature of their discipline. As Derrida once noted, dying cultures don't leave archives. Many of the central process of Welsh cultural history, language loss, secularization, shifts in classroom consciousness are not easily captured in data. They are actually felt experiences. Furthermore, he articulates at one point in Politics and Letters that bourgeois Britain was no longer my point of comparison. I was now Welsh European. That shift in perspective towards a plurality of Marxism and towards a more devoted post-British political imagination is crucial and interestingly related. To understand those processes, we need different tools from literary studies and from related disciplines like psychoanalysis. Although Williams rarely engaged directly with psychoanalysis, his novels are remarkably open to psychoanalytical readings. They are deeply interested in paternal and sibling relationships, in the foundations of cultural difference. So this is my first question. And the second question is, what impact did Williams' experience of teaching at adult education school have on the information of his cultural theory? After graduation from Cambridge, Williams taught in places like Hastings in South England for the Oxford Extramural Board. And the Raymond Williams Archive at Swansea University makes it very clear that many of his key ideas was first developed in the classroom. The archives has notebooks in which he sets out syllabi for his adult education courses, and one can see him thinking through how to communicate the development of intellectual thought in England and how to narrate it, who to include, and where to begin. From very early on, Williams understood that the idea of culture emerges alongside industrialization and also as a counter discourse to it. His book, Culture and Society, which is quite a famous one. I think this might be the first book that he come to know Raymond Williams. So this book begins with Edmund Burke, an Anglo-Irish figure from the periphery. Matthew Arnold also appears prominently in Williams' notebooks long before he's written into Culture and Society. So the adult education classroom was a space of intellectual experimentation, a space where Williams was actively shaping the ideas that would later define his cultural theory. The concept of culture is ordinary also grows out of this experience. Williams was engaging with working class students, people who were curious, thoughtful, and deeply interested in the kinds of questions he was asking. Stephen Collini has written about this period and accuses Williams of a kind of nostalgia for the pre-industrial England, which is not quite fair. Williams was always resistant to the nostalgia, while the concept of culture may carry nostalgic associations. Williams' formulation of it does not endorse them. This is what distinguishes Williams' approach from conservative nostalgia. He didn't romanticize the past. He sought to understand how cultural forms persisted, adapted, and interacted. And you could see those dynamics playing out in the adult education classroom among students from diverse backgrounds, grappling with ideas that were often excluded from elite institutions. So Williams' experience in adult education was foundational. It was a way of extracting cultural theory from cultural practice, of grounding abstract ideas in lived experience, and that commitment to the ordinary, to the everyday, remained central to his work throughout his life. And now we come to the question 3, how to understand Raymond Williams' structural feeling. The idea of culture as a symbolic system is in itself a compelling one, but structural feeling is a far more interesting and a generative concept than the way it's often used today, where it tends to be deployed in rather loose, metaphorical or allegorical ways. There's a real potential for a more rigorous or even scientific Marxist engagement with the idea of structural feeling. Structural feeling is not reducible to ideology. It's about how people live and experience their world, how they relate to one another, how they feel their way through social life. It's a way of conceiving a kind of domestic human interaction that doesn't erase difference. It holds on to the pluralism and particularisms that are at the heart of human experience. So we have this fascinating combination. On the one hand, something quite solid and structure, right? And on the other, something far harder to measure, feeling. It takes us beyond the empirical obsessions of traditional historical study towards something more like the constructualism of sociology on the one hand, and the symbolic and affective registers of literature and psychoanalysis on the other. So what Williams himself was reaching for is a way of understanding culture that could account for both its material conditions and its emotional affective life. And in that sense, structural feeling may well be most foundational concept in his entire body of work. And the 4th question, how should we understand his other important concept, cultural materialism, and what's the connection between cultural materialism and structural feeling? Cultural materialism and structural feeling are closely related concepts in Williams' thought. And though they operate at different levels, cultural materialism is similar in that it tries to bring together 2 domains that are often kept apart. One is the material, the actual empirical conditions of life, and the cultural, which Williams famously defined as a whole way of life, but also as artistic and symbolic creation. Cultural materialism was Williams' attempt to challenge 2 dominant tendencies. On the one hand, a materialist empiricism that had no room for cultural meaning, and on the other, a cultural idealism that ignored the material conditions that shape cultural production. So the relationship between these 2 concepts in Williams' thought is not deterministic. It's more dialectical. Each influences and reshapes the other. Culture is shaped by material conditions, but it also feeds back into those conditions, altering how people live and think. This is at the heart of his reinterpretation of the base and superstructure model. When Williams was developing cultural materialism, he was also trying to establish a new kind of discipline, one that break out of the narrow confines of English literature as a self-contained field. He wanted to create a space for interdisciplinary work that could engage with history, sociology, politics, and philosophy. In today's academic climate in China, I think in mainland China, where the new liberal arts was launched by China's Ministry of Education in 2020, disciplinary barriers in traditional liberal arts are meant to be broken down to promote interdisciplinary integration. So Williams cross-disciplinary thought has become more and more popular and it deserves a vibrant revival. And in contrast, structural feeling doesn't claim disciplinary authority. It's a way of thinking about human communities and the interactions between them. It's more open, more intuitive, and perhaps more accessible. But both concepts are central to Williams' project, and together they offer a powerful framework for understanding how culture works, but both emotionally and materially. And now we come to the fifth question. How are the concepts of culture, materialism, and structural feeling are applied or embodied in his fiction? Also Border Country, for example, is a profound exploration of how a native structural feeling continues to shape one's mode of thought and being, even after leaving the community in which that structure was formed. One way to frame the question is, to what extent is this a matter of nature or nurture? Can we ever fully educate ourselves out of the forms of thinking that made us? For Williams, this is both a class question and a national one. He himself moved from the border country of Wales to Cambridge, one of the central institutions of English intellectual life. He also moved out of the working class and into the upper middle class, at least in terms of his position within the academic and economic structure. So the question becomes, to what extent can he maintain a Welsh identity on the one hand and a working class identity on the other? That's a central tension that Border Country is exploring. And it doesn't offer easy answers. One of the novel's strengths is that it's not dogmatic or polemical. It's exploratory. It asks questions rather asserting conclusions. Matthew, the protagonist, is a Welshman who returns from London, where he is a professor, to his childhood home in the Border Country to witness the death of his father. The father represents a structural feeling rooted in a working class formation. Another key figure, Morgan Rosser, is also partly based on Williams' own father. One of the novel's ambiguities, as Claire Davis has persuasively argued, is that Morgan might actually be Will or Matthew's father, birth father, biological father. Matthew is also Will. At home, he's called Will. In his academic life, he's Matthew. And that was also true for Williams himself. He was known as Jim in Pandy, where he was grown up, and though Williams was the name on his birth certificate. So the novel is about dualities, about what you take with you when you live and what remains. The concept of a structured feeling is similar to Pierre Bourdieu's idea of habitus. The ingrained habits, dispositions, and ways of perceiving the world that are shaped by one's social environment. Assimilation often involves abandoning one's habitus in order to adopt another. Much of Welsh literature in the first half of the 20th century is about movement out of rural Wales, out of the Welsh language, out of the working class communities. But Williams sees the same narrative in D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, where Paul Morrell moves out of the Nottinghamshire coalfield into life as an artist. But Border Country begins with a return. That journey back to Wales, to family, to memory, informs Williams' writing for the rest of his life. It's where his theoretical frameworks become embodied in the tensions between past and present, between class and culture, between assimilation and continuity. And it's in those tensions that the real power of his fiction lies. The way his ideas become mobile in the novels is very much valued. He once said that any idea, if it is to have real purchase or legitimacy, needs to be tested on the ground. He wasn't interested in an intellectual sphere detached from everyday life. That's part of his Marxist inheritance. Philosophers are meant to challenge the world, not just to interpret it. The novel for Williams becomes a kind of halfway house. It's not the real world, of course. It's a constructed world, but it allows him to explore how his ideas might play out in the lived experience. He is interested in tensions, in contradictions, and some of those emerge subconsciously. No novelist is ever fully in control of their material, right? And now we come to the sixth question, the last but second. Is Williams' culture theory still valid to analyze the cultural phenomena and issues contained in contemporary cultural economic era? One way to interpret the idea a cultural economic era is through something like Adorno theory, affirmative culture. The idea that culture has become so thoroughly complicit in the workings of capitalism that all it can do is to affirm the unjust and exploitative system in which we live. When we speak of cultural industries today, we often mean culture's ability to generate profit. These are the industries in the sense that they contribute to the economic logic of the society we inhabit. In this context, the defense of cultural practice is often framed in economic terms. Culture is valuable because it brings in tourism revenues, or because the theater and the arts contribute to GDP. In China, the logic is especially visible in discussions around the humanities, where even progressive voices something fall into the language of value for money, and we have to narrate specifically what kind of social benefit our literary studies would bring to the society when applying for different levels of projects. But structural feeling is not discussed in those terms. One of the things that most appealed to me in Williams' work was his insistence that there's always potential for resistance, for opposition. We are never wholly determined by the economic and the cultural forces that shape us. We can make choices. We can imagine and create a different kind of society based on a different set of values. So it is worth noting that structure and feeling are not always in wholly affirmative relationship. Williams' model includes the dominant, but also the residual and the emergent. Within any given structural feeling, there are always elements that resist or exceed the dominant logic. The residual refers to the older ways of life and thought that have been repressed and marginalized but still persist. The emergent refers to new values and practices that are just beginning to take shape, often in opposition to the dominant. So perhaps the cultural economic era corresponds to what Williams in towards 2000 with Plan X, a vision of a technocratic, market-driven future. Today, we might call that neoliberalism, but if we turn our attention to the residual and the emergent, we find spaces of resistance, alternative ways of thinking and living that challenge the dominant order. This is where Williams' resistance to technological or economic determinism is most valuable. This is also where hegemony is never complete. There is always the potential to create counter-hegemonic forces. For Williams, a history of wealth demonstrated this vividly, whether in the persistence of national identity, the revitalization of the Welsh language, or the endurance of working class politics. Even under immense pressure from the center, alternative ways of thinking and being continued to emerge. That is an that is the enduring lesson of Williams' cultural theory, and one that remains urgently relevant today. So comes to my last question is how to understand, the most important concept of Williams, actually, how culture is ordinary. Today, the phrase culture is ordinary is often taken as common sense, but when Raymond Williams first articulated it in his 1958 essay of the same name, it was a radical intervention. This is a case where historicizing the idea is crucial. Philosophers often treat ideas in their ideal and formative form, but Williams, drawing on his cultural materialist approach, insisted on rooting ideas in the historical and social context that produced them. To understand what Williams was reacting against, it is helpful to consider two earlier models of culture. The first is Matthew Arnold's. Arnold is a central figure in the narrative that Williams chases in his book Culture and Society. Writing in the mid-19th century, Arnold saw culture as an antidote to the social fragmentation caused by industrialization, the rise of the working class, the decline of a religion. In the book Culture and Anarchy, he argued that culture, defined as the best that has been ever thought and said, could serve as a unifying force in society. It would be disseminated through a comprehensive education system and would help the middle class assume a new kind of moral leadership. Interestingly, Arnold found the essence of culture not in the English middle class, whom he saw as Philistine, but in the Celtic nations, especially Wales. He believed that poetry and imagination lived in the Celtic temperament, and that combining this with Saxon rationality would produce the ideal Englishman. So while Arnold's vision of culture was in some ways democratic, it was also hierarchical and racialized. By the early 20th century, this Arnoldian view came under critique. T.S. Eliot, for example, argued that culture had not unified the society, but had itself become debased. In the book Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, Eliot proposed a more elitist model. Culture should be preserved by a cultivated minority, not diluted through mass dissemination. This view shared affinities with Arnold's idea of the autonomy of culture, though Adorno's critique is more focused on the commodification of culture under capitalism. So on the one side, you have Arnold's trickle-down model of culture as social glue. On the other, you have Eliot's, to some extent, Adorno's vision of culture as something to be protected from the masses. Williams rejected both. For him, culture doesn't trickle down, it trickles up. Working class culture is not inferior or derivative. It is as valuable as any other form. If you are looking for the best that has been said, thought and said, you might find it not in the elite institutions, but on the football terraces, in folk songs, in jazz, or in rock music. This is the foundation of cultural studies as a field, the idea that popular culture is worthy of serious analysis. But Williams' claim that culture is ordinary is not a postmodern free-for-all. He doesn't argue that all cultures are equally valid in every respect. In fact, he often suggests that working class culture is preferable, not because it's more authentic, but because of its communal nature. It challenges bourgeois individualism and aristocratic detachment. It's vibrant, collective, and rooted in everyday life. And since the working class constitutes the majority, it's there that a genuinely democratic culture can emerge. of course, there are risks to this position. One could argue there's a privileging one form of culture over others, risks slipping into a kind of cultural authoritarianism. What matters is that Williams' idea of culture is ordinary redefined the field. It insisted that culture is not the preserve of elites, nor a tool of social control, but something lived and made by everyone. It's in our everyday practices, our shared experience, our language, our rituals. And that insight remains as powerful today as it was in 1958, especially if articulated in internationalist terms. Okay, I think that is all I have to present. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mingying. It's really nice to see this kind of terrain of Williams and his theory gone over again. And I think there is a nice kind of segue to Peter's concerns as well in this paper. So,
okay.
It should be on the desktop.
Yeah, I think I closed this. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So about half a century ago, it was already clear that there would be trouble if we don't do something about climate change. If we didn't do anything, and there is trouble, and a lot more trouble is coming. Having done nothing is still an understatement. Carbon dioxide emission, which contribute to climate change, rose by 46% between 2019 and 2023, despite the economic troubles of COVID. It's quite natural that people, scientists, academics, journalists, politicians, but also writers and readers of literature try to develop narratives to visualize what is going to happen to themselves, their families, their communities. Oh, what is happening? Well, sorry. To the humankind and the biosphere. Those narratives, however, have their political implications. I will compare the narratives of the climate change from three aspects. Their willingness to face the dire predicament, hope, and system friendliness. Three binary oppositions theoretically result in 8 options or 8 categories, but I find only 5. The reason is that the aspects of hope and system friendliness are irrelevant for narratives that don't face the predicament at all. Still, I have to include the category because it's crucially important. To start with, denial is a powerful tool human psyche can use to cope with the dire truth. There are various ways to avoid facing the coming collapse. Complete denial of climate change is not a marginal phenomenon. In August 2023, during a debate of presidential candidates of the American Republican Party, the candidates were asked if they think a human-induced climate change was going on, and none of the 8 politicians said they did. Some of them might have lied to flatter their prospective voters and due to the interests of their sponsors. But it's rather frightening that in the September 23, 2025 speech in the United Nations, Donald Trump explained the climate change was a con job and the green scam promoted by stupid people had harmed many countries. Climate denial didn't come from nowhere. It's not simply indifference, laziness, or collective stupidity, but rather the activity of power groups that are interested in combusting fossil fuel. Such groups have performed tremendous lobbying and propaganda activity to make people uncertain and believe that the problem is not so big that it required urgent action. For decades, people entertained the impression that scientists were having a huge debate, while they practically all agreed, apart from some easily discreditable scientists and research communities directly paid by the oil lobby. This strategy successfully delayed political and legislative action for decades. The methods were similar to those that big tobacco used to obfuscate public opinion about the unhealthy effects of smoking and the addictiveness of nicotine, so that legislative measures couldn't happen for a long time. All these strategies were clearly revealed by the book Merchants of Doubts, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway. The power group that effectively spread out to prevent action, I simply called oil lobby earlier. In the 2014 book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, Oreskes and Conway called it the carbon combustion complex. This campaign of disinformation is still going on, and it's highly effective among the Republican voters in the USA. Until the presidency of Ronald Reagan, there was no difference between Republican and Democratic voters' attitude towards environmental issues. But then, Republicans started regarding environmental protection as a brake of economic growth. The most probable cause they respond to climate change denial propaganda so enthusiastically is the interiorized neoliberal ideology that is phobic to governmental regulations. It is evident that reduction of greenhouse gas emission or all environmental programs depend on central government intervention. This phobic attitude is visualized by the slogan that climate activists are like watermelon, green on the outside, red on the inside. This narrative suggests that climate activism uses environmental issues as a pretext to initiate central government control. All the variants of the conspiracy theory of climate change are of narrative nature. The Chinese invented it to slow down American economy. Some leftist groups propagate it to deprive people and especially companies of their freedom. Some people spread it because they are stupid. These are all unreasonably optimistic stories, since the most important implication is that there is absolutely no problem with our lifestyle and economic system. Therefore, in lack of any real danger, there is no need for radical changes. Denialism has its literary examples too. Michael Crichton's novel, State of Fear, was #1 bestseller on Amazon for a week in January 2005, which fact indicates a huge public response to the idea that climate change is fake, eco-terrorism, eco-terrorists cause some seemingly natural catastrophes to spread fear because they want to raise money for their NGOs. This conspiracy theory might be reassuring against climate anxiety. The mainstream strategy seems to be the acceptance of the grand narrative of the ideology of progress. This narrative tells us that the human race has always been making progress towards our current lifestyle, or by extension, the biological development on Earth had always been a progress towards the human evolution. And since progress is the law of things, it's going to continue. Therefore, any current trouble must be temporary. Minor relapses are possible. Techno-salvationism believes that some technology will appear just in time to save the planet. The concept of sustainable development suggests that we can continue using more and more of the planet's resources without running out of them. Both climate denial, and the belief in progress has the political consequence of inactivity, which means the support of the establishment. As if no change was necessary, since those in charge, basically the political and financial elites, will lead us towards a better future. The narrative of progress is not politically innocent. It implies that there is no problem with the system itself, and we can undisturbedly continue with our exuberant lifestyle since our leaders, the economic, political elites, will eventually find a solution. It is also a very useful tool to hijack environmental fervor. In the name of progressive green technology, hundreds of billions of state subsidy go to the most polluting industries, such as the production of cars. According to the recent UNEP report, in 2022, the private sector invested $5 trillion in projects directly destroying nature. And this was stopped by $1.7 trillion state investment, which makes us globally spend $13 million on destroying nature in every single minute. Of course, only a fraction of this is covered by greenwashed projects, but that is also significant. The narrative of progress provides this economy with mass support. The mainstream discourse about the climate change suppresses alarming news with a rather effective hypothetical narrative that people need hope. Yeah, this was it. Otherwise, they wouldn't support the environmentalist agenda, sustainable development, etc., thinking it doesn't matter anyway. This is a system-friendly narrative again. The elites keep the population uninformed to avoid radicalization. The hope implied is that there is plenty of time for the system and the elites to somehow fix everything. We can just carry on and trust them. It's our children's future. We can worry and feel responsible for our children, but after all, it's not our personal future what is at stake. The next generation should fix it. Prediction is a risky business, but the current collapsology doesn't speak about the future anymore, but the collapse that is already going on. The pace of collapse is still questionable, but the need of reaction is real and urgent, while any trust in the system and the elites seems ill-founded. The hope might be an aesthetic requirement for popular narratives, such as disaster movies, of which very few address climate change directly. Some of them might use an allegory that might mean it, or mention it passingly to forget about it soon and engage in an adventure story. But as Lauren Colley put it, people go to disaster films not only for the experience of terror, but also of relief. In The Day After Tomorrow, this movie, which in many aspects reflects the absurdity and the urgency of our climate situation quite well, there might be a huge catastrophe which covers the global north with snow and brings a new ice age. But as a result, Earth's climate has been restored to balance thanks to the convenient phenomenon known as the albedo effect. In another sci-fi movie called 2067, extinction seems inevitable, and therefore a CEO wants to use a time machine to go 400 years forward to the future with her selection of survivors when the planet's atmosphere will have been cured in the absence of humanity. But the protagonist keeps saying, there must be another way. And in the finale, when he has only half a minute or so, he finds a way to save mankind. The hope might be a narrative necessity, but it might be harmful. It might have harmful consequences when it is regarded as a necessity of a grand narrative. Not all climate change narratives are so optimistic, but dystopian narratives are not necessarily less system friendly. When one tries to face the harsh reality, what Jem Bendel formulated with the concise triad inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction, the dimension of time or the tempo of the narrative makes a huge difference. In the highly influential 2015 deep adaptation paper, Bendel expected a very fast collapse, something like the Seneca Cliff, with which that insight is usually visualized that complex systems need long time to develop, but can collapse quite rapidly. Even in 2018, he said, it's possible that there will need to be food rationing in Britain in 3 or 4 years. How bad it gets and what the ramifications are depends on how well people and governments respond. But even if they respond well, that doesn't stop things getting much worse for the decades to come. That hasn't happened, as we all know. In his 2008 book, John Michael Greer counted on a long descent, arguing that, that when civilization reaches its peak, it takes as much time to collapse as it needed to develop. He didn't really take climate change into account, not to mention a runaway climate change, but he clearly stated that our industrial civilization depends on cheap energy, that is fossil fuel, mostly oil. And as soon as we used up half of the oil reserves, the collapse starts. The consumption of oil increases until that peak. He expected 2 or 3 centuries period of collapse until a deindustrialized civilization starts a new cycle. In 1970, King Hubert expected that the oil peak would be around 2000. Greer thought the top of the Hubbard curve will be in 2010. The oil production was actually growing until 2018, and after a significant decrease in 2020, it started growing again, and it's not impossible that after the relapse caused by COVID-19, it can still go higher than 2018. The 2024 data are still not available. In his 2023 book, Bendel already spoke of collapse as a long process, which, however, is already going on. A look at the Human Development Index and the Quality of Life Index clearly shows that the rather dynamic growth stopped around 2018 everywhere on the globe, and the slow decline started instead. Again, the most recent UN report shows some growth again in 2024. Post-apocalyptic narratives have a long tradition of representing human beings as a non-cooperative, caring only about individual survival and getting extremely violent once the control of an organized society stopped holding them back. As Jonathan Neal formulated the script of this kind of narrative, there are little groups of savages wandering the roads, scavenging and fearful, making tentative friends to keep the dark at bay. John Michael Greer called this popular scenario the road warrior narrative, the road warrior future, or the road warrior struggle of all against all. The latter formulation is more revealing of the narrative's Hobbesian background, quoting in translation his much repeated description of man's natural status, bellum omnium contra omnes. first published in the preface of the Citizen in 1642, and the concept that only a firm supervising state can withhold people from following their natural instinct to restart the ubiquitous war and reclaiming their universal right over all things was explained in more detail in his Leviathan. Readers seem to love to be shocked by representations of how evil human beings can be, but the political implication seems mostly, with some remarkable exceptions, system-friendly. If we want to avoid this dystopic future, we should stick to the establishment and follow the strong leaders who can guarantee order and protect us from the savage hordes. Collapsologists, however, contend that the road warrior future is improbable for two reasons. One of them is the local and global elites' countermeasures. When things turn bad, the elites do something to prevent not the entire society from suffering, but themselves from losing their privileges. And social crises also give elites opportunities to get richer and increase their power. Such countermeasures usually make things even worse. Neil thought the usual elite reaction to major societal disruption can be best demonstrated with what happened during World War II. She wrote, society didn't disintegrate. It didn't come apart. Society intensified. Power concentrated and split, and those powers had us kill each other. It seems reasonable to assume that climate social collapse will be like that. More inequality and the rise of authoritative regimes that start wars against each other is not the war of all against all, but maybe competing elites can this way sustain their grip on the population. As for the current elite strategies about preparing for climate change-induced societal collapse, Wendell described 5 of those that make things worse. Oh. Where is it? Okay. Suppressing public awareness of the full extent, the nature of the global predicament. The promotion of a range of authoritarian, counterproductive, and self-enriching measures on various societal disruptions. Preparing strategies for preemptive conflict to maintain capacities for war in a collapsing world system. Channeling of increasing public anxiety, dissatisfaction, and confusion into non-constructive agendas that serve factional interests. The de-radicalizing of the implications of recognizing our global predicament amongst the professionals that engage with the issue. These are not predictions about the possible future, but the descriptions of what is already happening. This first reason why the road warrior future is improbable might be the bad news. There might be better news too. According to Roger Bregman's book Humankind, people are much more cooperative, or to put it another way, nicer or kinder than mainstream representations suggest. While various academic disciplines seem to prove that Hobbes was wrong, there are also numerous scholars that demonstrate that his ideas were biased and designed to legitimize the oppressive power of his own class. Human beings are basically cooperative, and catastrophic circumstances usually increase their cooperative capacities, despite mainstream expectations and representations, as it is convincingly demonstrated by Rebecca Solnit through analysis of the aftermath of several disastrous events. The underestimation of the cooperative capacities of human communities is typical of the dystopic genre. But as Roger Bregman demonstrates, this only follows from the general trends of humankind's representations, not only in mass media, but also in literature, arts, and social sciences. If Bregman is right, people prefer cooperation to violence, and they can peacefully live together as far as they are left alone. However, nice cooperation within a community doesn't exclude violent hatred against others. It's not an unusual scenario in Cli-Fi that the protagonist's journey is, or in retrospect seems to have been, a quest for cooperative people, while the majority relapse to random violence. And the end result is the creation of a small-scale community which looks idyllic in the post-apocalyptic context. Let me refer to two post-apocalyptic thrillers in which, however, the cataclysm is not explicitly climate change related, although they tend to be read as Cli-Fi, as if the causes of the fictional cataclysms were either symbolically or indirectly referring to climate change. In Cormac McCarthy's The Road, the food supply for the survivors is limited to what they can find in abandoned houses, mostly canned food from before the catastrophe, apart from the flesh of other human beings. The protagonist's father abhors the cannibalistic ways of the hordes hunting for humans along the road. Cannibalism symbolizes the moral degradation of humankind after the collapse, while in this novel is the child who represents the extreme vulnerability of those who try to stick to the values of civilization. In Meg Allison's novel, The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, a pandemic wipes out most of the people while the food chain is not damaged, which means the chances of producing food depend only on human cooperation. But that is what this fictional world lacks the most. But eventually, the protagonist manages to join a well-working anarchist community, a former science base that survived the pandemic and successfully sustained the values of communal cooperation. The place is tellingly called Nowhere, which is English for utopia. But at the end of the road, too, the father entrusts his son to those non-cannibalistic people who, working well together, are heading south where it is supposed to be better. The solidarity of cooperativeness doesn't easily include others. People can trust each other inside their own community, even if this community is temporarily created for a short while. But they can still look at outsiders, others, with distrust, suspicion, or even hatred. Nice people can also be cruel in some circumstances. The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler is a typical disaster narrative as far as it contrasts two kinds of communities. That of the nice protagonist, who manages to collect around herself nice people ready to cooperate based on their mutual trust and solidarity, and all the other groups that base their short-term cooperation on a hierarchy enforced by the stronger. Violent groups are violent on the inside too, in this novel. The sequel, The Parable of the Talents, represents the model of small cooperative communities on local level as unviable. Olamina, the protagonist's settlement called Acorn, is attacked and occupied by well-funded religious fundamentalists, a semi-legal military group associated with the political government of the current president of the fictional USA. And she learns the lesson. She starts finding allies among the elite to establish a national and later global organization based on a network of rich and influential people instead of the grassroots development she experimented with in the first novel. She must join the elite to realize her dream of a harmonious community, a global brand of her own religion. This brings us to the last kind of narrative, which already involves the crucial problem of class. Donald Trump said in his ominous UN speech, the carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intention. Many environmentalists would agree with that statement, although hardly any sentence in the entire speech can be fact-checked. Big oil companies, British Petrol and Exxon, sponsored huge campaigns to promote the concept of carbon footprint, obviously to assign responsibility for climate change on the individual from companies or the system in general. One can easily recognize the counter effect of such strategies, contributing to the development of narratives which contrast the sacrifices expected from the poor, in reality rather from the middle class, with the exuberant ambition of the rich. Basic is the realization that the public discourse has been created which forces average people make some minor but sometimes uncomfortable changes in their life to keep them quiet without any claim to change the system, while the rich continue their super exuberant consumption without any disturbance. I put here two memes to give a sample. This is the first. Contrasting emission of cars and airplanes, and the other, I mean, this is one of the hundreds of memes about Taylor Swift, who says she worries about environment and climate change while using her private jet is, I mean, is so frequent that people find it a little bit problematic. Couple of years ago, the European Union refused to tax aviation fuel as heavily as they tax car fuel. The private jets are already responsible for about 2% of the total greenhouse gas emission of civil aviation. But those private jets are not mostly owned by celebrities, but companies. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when problems with civil aviation and health concerns pushed them towards this direction, when private jets emitted 4% of the aviation total, CEOs realized how much more comfortable it is to travel in private jets, and they still stick to the then developed habit. The moral is rather clear. I mean, especially the rejection of the EU of this kind of regulation. The per capita emission of the rich is unproportionate, but they also make the political decisions, and they rather put the burden of any change on the poor, or at least on the not so rich. The hypocrisy rightly causes anger. However, we should take into consideration two caveats. Those who are angry because they are told not to use their cars due to emission concerns, while the rich fly in their private jets like crazy, still belong to the global rich and are responsible for the climate change. The anti-elite sentiment seems legitimate, but it shouldn't be an excuse to avoid changes. If they can pollute, I pollute to attitude makes things worse too. Kim Stanley Robinson's 2020 novel, Ministry for the Future, implies a revolutionary approach to the moral dilemmas of the climate change. It's a rather optimistic narrative, so far as it envisions a future in which the human race can avoid extinction, stabilize the climate of the earth, and develop a fair way to coexist with nature. If we take into account the number of the global population at the end of this narrative, which means about 2 billion people, that in the end becomes able to run the new kind of global economy, one can say that the cataclysm is foretold to happen anyway. Some of the methods through which the most committed groups enforce the change are obviously illegal and also probably immoral by current majority standards. The insight that immediate change is needed results in actions that can even be described as terrorism. The Nepalian leader of the illegal operations of the Ministry for the Future tells about globally organized sabotages which have made coal industry unprofitable. This was the only way to convince global capital to invest in sustainable industry instead. This is illegal, but still morally acceptable as action for a bigger common good. To convince the rest that they should support the new sustainable economy, you need the moral of a revolution to find such actions acceptable. It's, however, undeniable that the ways the current capitalist economy is run are also described as immoral. But the official ethical value system is always defined by the ruling elite, which is not interested in changes. 2018 Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk's novel, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, is a whodunit, which subverts the genre's tradition of endorsing and stabilizing bourgeois morality. The murderer gets away, and she's glorious, boasting about her moral superiority over her victims who used to kill animals for fun. To achieve change, we need not only action, but also an alternative morality. However, I hope this new morality will not accept violence as legitimate. The future we imagine and expect influences our current political decisions and therefore forms our future too. I'm speaking about the future during and after the collapse that seems inevitable. We might have a softer collapse and a better future if we count on cooperation on local level and don't endorse ideologies spreading distrust, hatred, and suspicion, capitalizing on our fear to establish a suppressive authoritative system and increase the wealth and power of elites already oppressive enough. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much. Great. Mingying, maybe you can come back to the front. So have that. We'll have we have plenty of time for some questions, comments. Oh, and just as a friendly reminder for anyone in our audience who wants to speak, just make sure you hit the little blue button so that your question will also get recorded and just so we can all hear it better. Yeah, this is a really interesting pair of papers here. Let me see. I have questions for both interests, if I can do that. Maybe I can ask maybe both of you in a way to begin with on this, like, what do you see the kind of links between your concerns as reflected in your papers today around the question of culture and maybe the question of like social relations? So Peter, you had just ended talking about the kind of need for a new morality to come forward to deal with this incoming collapse. I also liked how you talked about it as a softer collapse. Like that's the choice, right? Between soft and hard for that and cooperation and things like that. So how would we get to that morality? Because we won't get there through abstraction, like thinking, oh, we have, reading better philosophy or something like that, but something in our social relations. And then with Mingying in your paper, I had a note here on it from Raymond Williams. So, that structure of feeling is such a great concept with him, and it's so useful for that, right? So what would be the structure of feeling today? Are there any signs where we can see a kind of feeling, so to speak, that would either help lead to that morality or address the future in some ways, right? You mentioned like towards, like a more, a democratic future or more kind of way out of some of the crises facing all our societies today. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on this? Like a between either one of you, like between your papers and your concerns? Yeah.
Yes, it's really a great question. I have never thought about that before. Yeah, the structured feeling today, I think, yeah, we got the really rigid kind of political atmosphere, right? Like we were talking about this afternoon, how it got supervised through the phone or etc. Yeah, it's pretty structured, right? And your behavior and your way of thinking is kind of I think trickling down from the top. We were educated how to think, from primary school, kind of that. But the kind of feeling, how people are lived and what you kind of get to choose, especially I think if you go to the mainland, and I think some of you are from the mainland, right? And you will see some of countering talks on, especially some of the I think the bloggers, is it called blogs on the social media, the TikTokers, and also those from Red Notebook, yeah, 小红书, and yes, you still see some of them. Their talk is not politically, not exactly politically right. They are sharing ideas that are, I think, is quite progressive and quite creative and really independent thinking, and that could be formed as a kind of emergent culture that could be can be a counter force to the dominant.
Okay.
Oh,
Camera. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the link is really the community, the collective. But if you ask a question how we can get a new morality, I wish I knew.
Yeah.
But it seems to be needed. And I think most of eco-critics try to find out how it is possible to develop a new one. I mean, it is interesting when some climate narratives or climate change narratives think that this new morality should be revolutionary, and it should involve violence as well. Again, it's possible that that's the way. I hope it's not, but it's really a possibility. I mean, we saw such movements which developed different morality and were successful in what? Seizing power, and it also performed major social changes too. So it is not impossible. I mean, there are historical examples, but also it is also possible that we should base this morality on local cooperation, little communities which were more or less disrupted by global economy.
Yeah.
But maybe we should try to redevelop them, and there where a softer collapse is possible. But again, I'm not so sure. I also see that several people think that some religious morality should be developed, and they find inspiration in some marginal religions or Buddhism or something like that. Again, possible. I'm personally not buying it, but I see that it's also a trend. Maybe this what is basic is to develop some kind of responsibility for what? I mean, Buddhism could be good for that, responsibility for everything, for the biospheres or of other, not only other people, other existence, animals, atmosphere, and so on.
Yeah.
So that's why it would be good. But again, I don't see how it can be done to propose this kind of morality for measure. And again, Buddhism sounds, but Buddhism can be violent too, as we saw in the case of Myanmar. So even if it seems so peaceful, maybe looks the most peaceful religion, still Buddhist monks performed a genocide in Myanmar a couple of years ago. So still tricky.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Thank you on that. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for this question of a reckoning and a morality that would have to develop from all of that. I mean, there have to be multiple things, I think, like that. And it is interesting to think of the media on those in some ways, because it's, you know, you have Twitter, we were talking about that earlier, or X, and how that kind of discourse around China and everything goes like that too. But at the same time, that's also the vehicle for other views, which are far better. They're maybe not the loudest ones, but there's a certain kind of plurality underneath it, some ways, that, you know, is not just a kind of singular a voice on that. Oh, the other thing I just wanted to mention, in the paper, you know, the structure of the feeling, what the other thing I like about that phrase is that it's also meant to get us to think about how feelings are produced by structures. You know what I mean? Like, so that it's like Williams, in that materialist moment of him, is that's where the feelings kind of come from, so to speak. Like, it's this kind of structural kind of material changes. If you are accelerating those or producing those or something like that, that in turn can have this, you know, kind of impact on how people's affect and emotions and things going. So, you know, in some ways, it's almost like any action is good in some ways. But I mean, I think in the US, the intransigence towards global warming, all that kind of stuff. So Trump is appealing on, anti-elitism and things like that. That's the whole discourse, right? And that works, right? But all this also works because everybody's completely dependent on the automobile and cheap gasoline. And they see that as a right. Yeah. And they get really angry over that, right? So I have a right to like burn as much I want, that kind of stuff, right? But like if you had, and I think it's worse in the US than in other places, in part because there is no public transportation. I don't make too much out of that, but like the fact that you can't imagine an alternative to that to begin with, because the structure isn't there, right?
Yeah, but again, this is not a coincidence. It not just happened that they don't have public transportation. It happened because the automobile factories, bribed or influenced the developers of American cities. Yes. So they created cities in the way that everybody needs a car. Yes. So they buy a car or two or three, or family. Yeah. And there is no way to live without a car, because the development of cities depended on people who wanted to sell cars. Yep. So again, maybe you can say that, okay, it's too late now we have this economy, but it's time to reverse it. To start to speak about it. Why do they have a car? Why don't they? Why the Americans cannot live without a car? Why they cannot walk to buy a bread?
Yeah, like, exactly. Yeah.
While in European cities it is possible.
It's not.
Right. And it is possible to just go around the corner and go to the groceries, or use a public transportation.
Yeah.
It is possible in China too. Yeah. Actually.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the transport, China has a high-tech answer to that. I don't know what to make of it, but like
the drones and all that kind of stuff, just get everything delivered. I mean, that also has its carbon footprint or whatever, but it is different. So in some ways, this is such a kind of uniquely American influence or problem, I think, like this resistance and intransigence to it in some way. Anyway, I ask our folks here out here, do you have any questions or comments about either paper or the panel as a whole? Anybody? Yeah. If you do, just, please chime in. So yeah, it's a really interesting question here. I also appreciated in your paper, Mingying, the rehearsing this around Williams and how he is, I forget what the first slide was, but the kind of Welshness of him, and that in cultural studies, it's like there was some of the reception of Williams is that he represents like old cultural studies in the sense that there was no appreciation of difference or location or colonialism or all these kinds of things. And so the cultural studies develops later in these other directions, but it ends up being almost defined against what he was trying to do, right? And it's actually not so much the case. It's much more complicated, right? He's also marginal in some ways. I mean, to be this working class kind of Welsh person in that world of Oxbridge, et cetera, you don't get much more marginal in that way than that, I think, in some ways. So yeah, appreciate that on that. Very interesting.
He's quite marginalized when he studies in Cambridge, and also not only he studies there, but also after he became professor, in the teaches at Cambridge, and he was still marginalized, and he declared that it was never my Cambridge.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember he wrote an essay on that. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Maybe I can ask a question too for that. I remember we had attended a conference about a year ago, a little bit more than that, up at your university. Yeah, a little bit more. Time goes too quick. There were several papers and a lot of discussion of Raymond Williams, actually, from people. I remember scholars from Japan and all the, yeah. Is it like, what is the status or reception of Williams now, like in mainland cultural studies or cultural theory? Is it, I mean, his works are, I know many have been translated, but is he still kind of a operative figure, influential, or people returning to him?
Yeah, I think most scholars know Raymond Williams, and from different departments, in the Department of Media, and also from Department of Sociology, and I think, and some of them, of course, from foreign language department, right?
Yeah.
And I see many PhD papers on Raymond Williams culture theory, Raymond Williams theories on sorry. Yeah, his other tragedy, sorry.
Oh yes, the work on tragedy, yeah.
Was work on tragedy. And also but said on his novels. And everybody seems to know him, and everybody uses his theories of culture. But few people know that he's Welsh, and few people know about his fiction. And when we talk about Raymond Williams, did he write novels?
Yeah.
But actually, Raymond Williams himself put really huge emphasis on his creative writing. He contributed spent far more energy and time on novel writing than on he's thinking of on his formation of culture theory.
Yeah.
So I think his culture theory kind of formed in the process of his novel writing.
Yeah.
So it's really worth, like I said also in my paper, that Raymond Williams, theory really worth revival.
Yeah.
And he actually, his way of doing academic research is very cross-disciplinary. He never limit himself on literary studies or something like that. Like he's a sociologist, right? And he's many other types. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I also appreciate that the culture is ordinary. That always gets misunderstood. And so that your emphasis on that being communal, right? Or there's something that's non-individualistic. So it's very different than the atomized world which we're often in, where it's like scrolling or doing something like an individual consumption. So his notion of culture is that, right? So it's not, I thought that was a good point. It's not that it's more authentic or something like that. He's not romantic in that way, like about working class or whatever popular culture is, but that it's something done by groups of people. Is it something communal or communitarian, if I can use that word about it that way? Maybe that's the link too with environmental in some way, that we, like we don't see ourselves as living in these communities, which we are literally a part of ecologically, right? But that what we're doing is part of that. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, Wayne, please. Blue light, thanks.
Sorry, so I think a question directed to Dr. Zhou, if you don't mind. I basically have a question because I think it's near the end of the presentation, you mentioned that about the validity of the concept of structural feeling into this cultural studies here. I agree, because I also have my thesis developing here to talk about structural feeling in Hong Kong here, and at the same time to talk about the culture of resistance here. And I think that's also something that posited by Stuart Hall himself as well, when he also talks about slightly, because it's one of his lecture on cultural studies as well, is basically talk about the cultural resistance and basically emergent culture, but also have to use basically the residual cultures here. But one of the theoretical concerns I have here is that, yes, it's important to think about the starting point, that is the creation of this opposition culture here, or this culture of resistance we talk about here. The thesis I'm developing here is also saying that it's also thinking about one theoretical complex here is that, well, we can think about leveraging both the oppositional elements in the residual and also the emergent cultures here. There seems to some kind of tendencies here, as for instance, more like controversial cases that the anti-Islam movement in Hong Kong here. So one of the things that I'm writing about is that, sure, there can be something revolutionary about it, but at the same time, it's also something that Williams himself also, you mentioned already, is that he's heavily against is that there should be no that kind of romanticization of this kind of nostalgia here of the past here. But we also, in some occasions, we see this kind of tendencies happening in certain, those kind of, cultural opposition here. So how would say, would you deal with this kind of, the inherent dialectical relationship between the residual and the emergent here? I think that's something I'm also interested in, because it seems to be saying that to have this kind of new imagination, a new different set of values here, it's easy to talk about it, but at the same time, it's also to have a slippery to this kind of what Williams is fighting against, this romanticization, this kind of very more always saying that's this kind of a restorative nostalgia we're talking about, like that we've seen before in some of the social movements. That's my question. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. You seem really listen very carefully. I wonder whether I understand your question correctly. Are you asking about the residue and emergent culture here in
Yes, because
Hong
it's
Kong?
like not just in Hong Kong, but basically both in the dialectical relationship between these two, because both of them, at least how to Hall positive at a certain point, is like it's both having oppositional elements here that both are quintessential to think about culture of opposition and also resistance here. At the same time, as simply to me is like political practicality to kickstart or ignite this kind of social movement here, but it's also having some kind of dangerous slippery in itself. So I was thinking about that when we are actually engaging in these political projects here, when we even think about this press morality and those kind of political projects we talk about right now, how should we carefully think about the leveraging, the use of these two forces here, and the dialectical relationship between these two forms of culture we talk about right here, the residual and the emergent here, so that we don't fall into the trap that Williams keeps reminding us in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I think Raymond Williams actually made a careful distinction between residue and archaic. So residue culture is not archaic culture. It is something that is still lived and still I think still working functions in the nowadays life, and still has able the kind of vitality or the energy that could be formed in still usable or could still conform to the emergent culture, and together with the emergent culture can form kind of a new dominant force, and then countering or opposed to the current one. I think it's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's good. I forgot about the archaic. Right, I forgot about that part. Yeah. Oh, it's key. Yeah. Great. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Well, actually, my question is mainly for Professor Zhou. Yes, I'm really interested in the Williams structure of feeling. Yes, like you said before, in China, culture is closely tied to the market, and the commercial logic shapes culture production and values. So as a result, some forms of resistance tend to be depoliticized. Yeah. So for instance, dissertations with involution and overwork is often expressed as emotional consumption. Yeah. So my question is from the Williams perspective, how might he interpret this dynamic if he were writing today?
So the question is about nowadays. Okay.
Oh, just clarify my question, right?
The first part of the question is the situation you described is nowadays China, right? About the economic kind of, yeah.
I mean
the emotional part. Okay.
I mean in his theory, and you mentioned before, you said commercial logic can shape culture lifestyles, right? Yeah. So nowadays in China, I think some forms of resistance tend to be depoliticized. For instance,
depoliticized.
Yeah, sorry. Depoliticized.
Okay.
Yeah. So for instance, dissatisfaction with overwork, is often expressed as emotional consumption. Yes, so I'm really hope to know how might Raymond Williams interpret this dynamic if he were writing today. So that's my question.
Yes, I think Williams would be really. Yes, you're right. Our culture is quite depoliticalized, and Williams really said, to see that. I think at one point that Williams was talking about English culture, back then in the 80s, were also kind of depoliticalized. What is the word he used? I forgot it was in my paper. That's the word. Yes, he was talking about how culture, especially the kind of working class culture, is no longer talking about politics. So he's really like to repoliticalize the discourse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I remember. I think I guess it's been said before too, but like when we think back of Williams and even Hall later, but more so with Williams, like he's writing, and so much of his work is also rooted in a way in some kind of connection to the Labor Party or labor movement, which he was kind of intimate with, and that was kind of like part of his Oh yeah, it's not even directly in the theater, or excuse me, in the theory so directly, but it's like he could speak in a way to a public sphere that wasn't totally kind of atomized or just about individual consumption, you know? And that's different than much of, I think, UK and even other places today. So it's harder to do that, you know, like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, although Williams is quite a leftist, right? New
Yeah.
left, a representative of the new left, but he was never consulted by the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And he was quite alienated from
Yeah.
them. And
Yeah.
he himself, he said, I think in one of his articles, sadly said that I was never, received one consultation from Labour Party. And also in the May Day manifesto, I think he criticized the kind of politics or the kind of government the Labour Party organized.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I guess I'm thinking more like more to like the labor movement, like other working class people, like a sense of a kind of working class community that he's somehow part of his, I don't know, mind or whatever he's thinking of, like that. Because it's interesting that, and Peter, you ended the talk too by looking at this question of class. Like class and culture for him were like inseparable, you know? And it's, I think, really hard for people to think in those ways in general, especially now. There's even fewer. Like Bourdieu, it's kind of in there too, but it's so different than in Williams in a way. Yeah.
In today's society, probably we kind of the class discourse is kind of we're not encouraged to talk about in class terms, right?
Right.
But actually, there are classes, right?
Yeah.
All kind of different levels. So
yeah.
At least.
Yeah. I mean, there are. That's really interesting, and it's funny because that's like what the denialism around climate change feeding directly into that in some ways, because like Trump will tap into that.
Yeah, I remember the word classlessness.
Classlessness.
Yes.
Yes.
Who criticized the new liberal societies become kind of classlessness.
No classes anymore. Yeah. Yeah. The decline of that consciousness. Ugh, creepy. Actually, Peter, I had a question for you too. I don't want to keep us long as we want, but this was great for me because I haven't read the novels that I've been wanting to. So one of my questions is, which one of those should I read first? Is that kind of one? But then other one, like the comparison you were running there between like a Hobbesian view and the Bregman, and then Solnit or other people kind of talking about we have this capacity for cooperation that comes up, right? Yeah, it's interesting because I teach Hobbes sometimes, and I think he's brilliant. And to think that this is being written in the 1600s to me really quite cool. Anyway, which of them are right? And so to speak, if you have to choose. But then, what I don't want to necessarily acknowledge always, but like when I went back and started teaching Hobbes, and I would teach Freud a little bit later and things like that, and I had already been teaching some Freudian stuff, is that there's a really alternative view of human nature in Hobbes or in Freud for that. It doesn't call it that, but that the emphasis on aggression and that human instincts are not pretty necessarily, right? Freud's even so explicit about this, right? I mean, how do you kind of parse that? Because one way to think of that in terms of how can we get towards more cooperation, or what are some of these, not just cooperation, but rationality around climate catastrophe and things like that. Maybe the biggest, you got the obstacle of capitalism and kind of private companies and the kind of power of capital, right? But you've also got this obstacle of human nature at some level, right? Yeah.
Yeah, of course, there are many problems with that. And very probably the truth is somewhere in between, as usual. So it's, I think these books I referred to, Bregman and Solnit,
Yeah.
So what they really criticize is this Hobbesian-based representation of human nature, and they really deconstruct a lot of narratives which very much basic for our consciousness about the human nature, like the Princeton experiment prison experiment. Bregman explains how it was completely wrong. I mean, the representation and also the story of the missing hero when a woman was killed in New York and was represented that nobody called the police, and it turns out they called the police. Several people called the police.
Okay.
So it was a completely wrong representation of what happened in this. It is experiment. It's several many stories which are basic when we think about how human beings react to catastrophes. I mean, also Solnit's books also about the Katrina hurricane aftermath. I mean, the media representation said everybody was just going around killing each other and so on. Turns out one person was killed by the National Guard when they killed some people. One person when they thought that people are really, loitering, which was true and not, because they really went to some houses to get some medicines to help other people. Because people needed medicine.
Yeah.
So one of those people were killed by the National Guard. Otherwise, nobody was killed, and people were rather cooperative and helping each other. So a lot of such stories in which it turns out that we have some Hobbesian prejudices, which preforms the understanding of what is going on in such extreme situations, and the reality is not so bad at all. So I think they are very convincing in these descriptions of these stories. On the other hand, again, they disregard the situations when there are conflicts between groups, which can be cooperative on the inside. Still, they can be violent against others. We also have a lot of such stories in which people develop a strong bond very fast, and still they regard this bond as better than others have, and they regard their own group as better than the others, which gives them the right, and so on. So I think it is the picture they paint is too nice, but still the basic criticism of the Hobbesian description of human nature is also right in some way.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the question which book to read. I mean, it depends what you want to get. I mean, this is not great literature, I'm afraid. Probably The Ministry of the Future is the most interesting book.
Okay.
I mean, with this narrative structure, with 30 something narrators and so on, it's not uninteresting. That's all.
Okay.
So yeah. So I also have the impression that The Road is regarded as sci-fi because it's a good novel, even if it's not a sci-fi.
Oh, yeah.
So people who, eco-critics sometimes want to write on a good book, so make sci-fi what it is not.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Great. Any other questions or comments from the field? I think, we're within the 2 hours, but that's a good time to maybe wrap up. So thank you all for coming today, and thanks again. A whole round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for coming. Yeah, really interesting talks like this. Yeah.
really think there is some connections with Williams in this too, the kind of culture.
It's not a high culture.